Gallaudet University is a school dedicated for studies of the deaf and hard of hearing. It is located in Washington, D.C. Only small amounts of hearing undergraduate and graduate students are accepted yearly, since the school aids in special services for deaf and hard of hearing students. We found two different dates that were considered the opening year. Some say the school began in 1856 as the Kendall School, but in 1864 the school became the National Deaf-Mute College, later named Gallaudet University. Gallaudet University is a federally chartered institution consisting of a board of trustees with at least 3 seats of Congress reporting annually to the Department of Education. Gallaudet University was established for the deaf, dumb, and blind, but during the years they moved towards just the instruction for the deaf and hard of hearing. The history of Gallaudet University begins in the early 1800s by Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet. The school was named after him. Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet met his inspiration to become further educated in the deaf by meeting Alice Cogswell, who was deaf. He studied his methods to teach deaf and blind in Europe, and in 1816 he moved back to the United States, where he became president of the American School for the Deaf. He died in 1851. In 1856, Amos Kendall, an American lawyer, journalist, and politician that served as a United States Postmaster General, established a school called the Kendall School. He donated 2 acres of his land in northeast Washington, D.C., where Gallaudet University is now located. He donated the land to establish housing and schooling for 12 deaf students and 6 blind students. In June of 1857, the Kendall School merges into the Columbia Institution for the Instruction of the Deaf, Dumb, and Blind. During this time, Amos Kendall asked for a charter, but it is not granted until 1864. Between 1858 and 1859, the school grows up to 14 deaf students and 7 blind students. In 1861, at the start of the Civil War, the school was used as a hospital for sick soldiers. The school was praised at the end of the war for keeping the institution safe because there was not a single injury or death within the war. During this time, Amos Kendall names Edward Minor Gallaudet, son of Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet, superintendent. In 1864, Abraham Lincoln signed the Enabling Act authorizing college degrees. Each diploma was signed by the current President of the United States. In fact, it is still being signed by the President currently in office at the time of graduation. Here we have a diploma from 1973 signed by former President Richard Nixon. This diploma, if you can see it, is from 1993 and signed by former President Bill Clinton. In 1864, the former Columbia Institution for the Instruction of the Deaf and Dumb and Blind becomes a National Deaf-Mute College. They drop the instruction for the blind and become more focused on deaf and hard of hearing students. At this time, Edward Minor Gallaudet becomes the official president of the institution. In June of 1869, Melville Balliard becomes the first official graduate of the college. In 1883, as the college is slowly growing, the first football team is established, and in 1886, women are allowed to attend under an experimental basis. In 1889, the famous statue of Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet and Alice Cogswell is established and is still standing today. It is said that with the appearance of Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet upon the scene, the history of deaf of this country begins. Camp 2012. 1 year later, in 1890, Agatha Teagle Hansen is the first woman to graduate with a 4-year degree. In 1894, the National Deaf-Mute College changes its name to Gallaudet College, incorporating degrees in liberal arts and sciences, thanks to the Gallaudet College Alumni Association. Edward Minor Gallaudet retires in 1910, and as shown here, Percival Hall, former mathematics professor of Gallaudet College, becomes the second president. In October of 1986, Gallaudet College becomes Gallaudet University, and the Association for Alumni changes its name to Gallaudet University Alumni Association, GUAA. The GUAA published and distributed the basics of parliamentary procedures written especially for deaf students. 1988 was a major milestone for the deaf students of the university and for the deaf and hard of hearing community on a whole. The students marched to protest the hiring of a deaf president to represent Gallaudet University and not to hire Elizabeth Ann Zinsser. The students felt that Miss Zinsser could not understand what it meant to be a deaf student in a hearing world and that she could not satisfy the need of the growing deaf school population. The protest lasted a week and classes were put on a standstill. Students believed that a deaf president would represent the institution better. After her resignation on the fourth day, I. King Jordan became the first deaf president of Gallaudet University. Here is what I. King Jordan had to say. Challenging and growing times for Gallaudet started in the 1990s when the American with Disability Act was signed into law. The act protects the rights of the disabled towards an education, employment, accessible buildings, and any other reasonable accommodations. This law allowed the students to become more independent, to gain better means of employment after graduation, and fully realize their potential within the community. However, with the Act in place, it also readopted and amended the Individuals with Disabilities Act of 1972. With this amendment, it noted that students had the right to choose whichever institution they see best fit for themselves, not regarding those institutions that may seem as restrictive and catered for individuals with disabilities. Gallaudet is considered a restrictive institution, and this in return affected student enrollment. Tragedy struck the university in 2000 and 2001 when two murders occurred within a 6-month gap. Ben Varner and Eric Plunkett, who were both 19-year-old deaf students, were found dead in their dorm rooms. By February of 2001, the same month, the second student was found dead. Another Gallaudet student was arrested and confessed to both students' murders. Joseph Mesa Jr., 20, was also a deaf student. He had originally confessed that robbery was the motive for killing both students, but in 2002 he pleaded that a pair of black evil gloves haunted him and forced him to kill both students. He was found guilty and sent to prison. Society labeled Gallaudet as unsafe and felt that the institution would be safer with more hearing students attending it.
Now add one more to the list, Gallaudet. This weekend, a scene from 20 years ago reoccurred, and students vow they will be heard. Here's CNN's Gary Nuremberg.
In 2006, another Deaf President Now protest was held at the university after the Board of Trustees voted to revoke the appointed Dr. Jane Fernandez as president. The university felt that Dr. Fernandez was not sufficient enough to take the role as president, and the students wanted them to appoint another deaf president. By December, an alumni and former professor of Gallaudet University, Robert R. Davila, was hired as interim president for the university for 2 years. T. Allen Hurwitz, another deaf alumni, was then selected in 2010 as president of the university. He is currently still the president of Gallaudet University. In 2012, Gallaudet faced another controversy due to their chief diversity officer, Dr. Angela McCaskill. Dr. McCaskill was placed on paid leave because she had signed a petition for Maryland's same-sex marriage law. The event sparked an issue within the university because she represented diversity on campus. Her administrators thought that she did not encourage, maintain, or sustain an open-minded thought in terms of gay-sex marriage. She was asked to read a letter of apology on behalf of the choices that she made, but she felt that she was being bullied by her administrators. She was reinstated back as Chief Diversity Officer after 3 months, mainly to the fact that the students felt that she can represent Gallaudet University because she is a deaf alumni of the institution. Here is what Dr. McCaskill had to say.
I'm dismayed that Gallaudet University is still a university of intolerance, a university that manages by intimidation, a university that allows bullying among faculty, staff, and students.
With almost being 150 years old, Gallaudet University has a vast history for such a small institution. Today, they sustain 1,184 students, with less than 100 hearing students per graduating term. They have represented a community that was once seen as being a burden and now flourish a diversity of students that can be a part of a competitive hearing world. In catering for students with disabilities, Gallaudet University found a way to enhance the knowledge of those students that are deaf and hard of hearing. In the past, it was a struggle for the institution, especially since deaf and hard of hearing people weren't accepted as being productive in society or being able to work as everyone else. The transition from its past history can be seen that Gallaudet continues to flourish as a nation's liberal arts and science institution that caters specifically for deaf and hard of hearing students. In creating an awareness of the diversity of the deaf community, Gallaudet University has influenced deaf education through incredible growth of the institution itself.